We're ready to go with our information and intelligence sharing panel. We've kind of touched a little bit on this in the first two sessions today. General Hayden talked about sort of the evolving nature of how this is going and some of the issues that have evolved over the last years and how this is being done. And in the biometrics and identity panel, we talked about the sharing between DoD, DHS and FBI on biometric data and so forth. But we're real fortunate now to really sort of drill down on the subject with the subject matter experts that are working these issues every day. And we're delighted and honored to have with us once again at AFCEA Kshemendra Paul. Kshemendra was appointed by the President as the Program Manager for the Information Sharing Environment. In that role, he has government-wide authority to plan, oversee the build-out, and manage the use of the information sharing environment. He also co-chairs the White House's Information Sharing and Access Interagency Policy Committee, and he's a recognized leader across government in leading best practices for information sharing and access. Prior to his current job, he was the federal chief architect in the Office of Management and Budget, and in essence, the architect for the government-wide programs. And he's seen as a real leader and has played major roles in government-wide efforts, such as data.gov, IPv6, recovery.gov. And as we looked at our tight budgets and our discussions we've had to date, we talked about the need to look across government and to look at how government can be streamlined by looking at government-wide enterprise approaches. So we're extremely fortunate to have with us Kshemendra Paul, who is a recognized leader in championing many of these initiatives. With that, Kshemendra, I'll turn it over to you, and it's your show. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everybody. We have quite a distinguished panel here, real leaders across all aspects of government, folks that have been working on intelligence and information sharing for many, many years in many different roles. I'm honored and privileged to be able to call these folks my collaborators and friends, and I want to just spend a moment introducing them. We're going to, after I introduce them, each of them is going to provide a brief overview of an aspect of intelligence and information sharing with a focus on the National Network of Fusion Centers, and then we're going to get into a little bit of Q&A, maybe a little bit of intellectual jazz here as we go back and forth, and then we're going to ask for some questions from the audience. So think about questions you'd like to ask this very distinguished group. All the way at the other end is my friend and colleague Russ Porter. Russ is a longtime leader, grew up in law enforcement in the state of Iowa, rose to the top of the community there, and then came into the government a number of years ago. Now is Director Clapper's key representative with the law enforcement Homeland Security community. Next to Russ is Scott McAllister. Scott is an alumni of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. He also co-chairs the Fusion Center subcommittee underneath the Interagency Policy Committee that I chair with Charlie Bartolis on the National Security Staff. He is the Deputy Undersecretary of Intelligence and Analysis at Department of Homeland Security. Next is Christian Beckner. Christian recently has left the Senate. He was the Associate Staff Director for Homeland Security and Prevention on the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. He currently is the Deputy Director of George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute. Christian and the committee that he co-chairs, I have to thank for my last two jobs, the current job and the previous job, because they have oversight over both eGov and OMB, and as well as have been a key author of the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. Then immediately to my left is Mike Sena. Mike is the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. That's the Fusion Center in the San Francisco Bay Area and Northern California more broadly. Mike is also the president of the National Fusion Center Association and a key partner and colleague in our efforts, whole of government, as we look at law enforcement, counterterrorism, and homeland security information sharing. Mike is a sworn law enforcement officer with the California Department of Justice. Okay, so let's start with Russ. Russ, if you could say a few words about your perspective on fusion centers.
Thank you. Thanks, Kshemendra. And thanks to my fellow panelists, by the way, who I've known for many years, and I'll just say to you, in the interest of time, respect. Thanks. What a great facility this is, and thanks to AFCEA for letting us be here. Great hotel. The bath towels are so thick I could hardly close my suitcase this morning. I'm going to focus my remarks today on the history in our country as it relates to state and local law enforcement intelligence, because from where I sit and from where I came, that's kind of the framework, the skeletal framework for what we have today with the National Network of Fusion Centers. As Kshemendra said, I spent 34 years in state and local law enforcement. 28 of those years spent in the criminal intelligence discipline, or the police intelligence discipline, which is a highly unusual trajectory on a career. And I retired as the Director of Intelligence and the State of Iowa Fusion Center a few years ago before joining the DNI. So I want to get into some of the history just that predates fusion centers so that you are exposed at least to some of that history. And when I use the word intelligence during this segment, I'm not talking about intelligence as we often talk about it here in Washington, D.C., in the intelligence community. You know, not intelligence as in foreign intelligence or counterintelligence. I'm using the term as in information upon which a course of action can be rested. Should we plan and act in ignorance? Should we expect our state and local officials to plan and act in ignorance? I think it was Forrest Gump that said, ignorance is a wonderful thing. You're constantly surprised. And I think we ought not be constantly surprised, nor should we expect state and local officials to be constantly surprised. So, again, from my perspective, as I talk about intelligence in this segment, I'm talking about it from that standpoint, kind of the old Sherman-Kent broader application of it. And intelligence in state and local law enforcement, going back into the 1800s, has been used a lot of different ways. Some have said the father of police intelligence is a guy in the 1920s from the New York City Police Department, Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino. So it goes back a long ways. But it really expanded and grew in terms of its use in the 1960s. And so lest you think that fusion centers might be a totally new idea or off the wall, let me just share with you some of the background from the 1960s. You remember this explosive growth in crime, the drug and the counterculture and protests against the wars. And so the federal government at that time got involved in trying to help the justice agencies become more effective, really kind of created a criminal justice enterprise. And in 1967, the President of the United States, with his President's Commission on Crime and the Administration of Justice, just typically called the President's Crime Commission, 1967, issued a report, and here is one of the things from that report. Every major city police department should have an intelligence unit to focus solely on gathering and processing information on organized crime. And it went on to say that, but the recognition that there was this real crime problem and that some of it was organized. That same year, you recall all the riots and the disorder inside the United States, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, commonly called the Kerner Commission, issued a set of recommendations, one of which was this: an intelligence unit staffed with full-time personnel should be established to gather, evaluate, analyze, and disseminate information on potential as well as actual civil disorders. So back in 1967 we were seeing this. We saw the federal government begin to support, through funding, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, support the development of these efforts, and to build standards. 1973, the National Advisory Committee on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals had a whole series of recommendations that every police agency in every state should establish and maintain the capability to gather and evaluate information and to disseminate intelligence. In other words, develop a capacity to address the most serious problems that we were facing in our communities, our states, and our nation. So for a guy like me that comes from this background of state and local law enforcement, the police intelligence discipline, this sets the stage for the need or the desire or really the requirement for state and local agencies to have access to the kinds of information upon which a course of action can be rested, be it suppressing disorder, fighting crime, adjusting security posture. Now in the 1970s we faced a host of problems because we didn't have good standards and good rules. on what these capabilities were, how they should be bounded. Places like New York City, if you're not familiar with it, there's the hand-shoe authority and the hand-shoe agreement, which was brought about because of assertions that the intelligence capability of the New York City Police Department had gone too far, reaching into the community. Chicago, there was a Cook County grand jury in 1975 that found improper police intelligence activities, and so on. This goes on. And after those things came up, we began to put in place rules and guidelines that would help guide this. Ultimately, what happened, though, was that police intelligence activity started to really go away. In fact, in many agencies, it was eliminated. But what remained was counter-drug intelligence. And the U.S. government had, in fact, the White House published in February of 2001 the General Counter-Drug Intelligence Plan, giving guidance on how to push forward in a structured way with counter-drug intelligence. And that was going along. The rest of the intelligence capabilities at state and local levels really weren't strong until September 11th of 2001. And at that time, a lot of the people who had been working on these issues at the state and local level stepped forward with the help of IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the COPS office at the U.S. Department of Justice, funded a criminal intelligence sharing summit in March of 2002, shortly after 9/11, published a report in August of 2002 calling for the creation of a national criminal intelligence sharing plan and the creation of a criminal intelligence coordinating council. The U.S. Department of Justice stepped up and really helped sponsor that, along with interagency partners, PMISE, FBI, DHS, and others. That plan was written. Interestingly, the National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan had many of the similar thoughts from the 1960s. But the words, or the term, fusion center, appears nowhere in that document. Yet it became the basis upon which the fusion center efforts emerged and guidelines came from. So I'll take you up to that point where we got to that stage of development. Fusion Center guidelines, the baseline capabilities, all of the work to protect privacy and civil liberties so that fusion centers would have privacy and civil liberties guidelines and have a policy for that and train to that. All of that came out of the great work through the CICC that I just mentioned. And so even though many of the issues remain the same in history in terms of the need for information and intelligence to develop a great course of action, and the need to protect privacy and civil liberties and civil rights. As Yogi Berra said, the future ain't what it used to be. And we're at a stage where, even though this is a great foundation for building the capabilities that we have now and that my colleagues here are leading, we have more to do. Engaging other government disciplines effectively, ensuring that the private sector has information that the private sector needs to protect critical infrastructure and other things, and that's been borne out in the NIAC report and in Kshemendra Paul's office as well that has acknowledged that. So there's still a lot more work to do, and with that, Kshemendra, I will stop and turn it over to another panelist.
Thank you, Russ. Next is Scott McAllister, and Scott's going to pick up the story and really talk more about the current situation, about what federal agencies are doing to support the National Network of Fusion Centers, and a little bit about the current snapshot of the network.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Like Russ, I come from 36 years of state and local law enforcement. We're just a couple of crusty old guys here that are threading our way through the federal system here, trying to add value. But appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm honored to be with not only you folks, but with the other panel members here, in particular Kshemendra, for his great leadership in the information sharing environment that we strive for. I just want to touch base real quick on the idea of the pre-9/11 versus the post-9/11 environment. When you look at through the lens of state and locals, prior to 9/11, there was no knowledge of terrorism tactics, techniques, and procedures. There were no security clearances issued to key stakeholders within the state and local government. There was no classified systems issued to state and locals in their intelligence centers. Fast forward to today, there's over almost 5,000 security clearances issued to state and local key stakeholders. We have the National Network of Fusion Centers. that has the ability to receive threat information from the intelligence community and add value to that. The fusion centers for the department is part of a distributed architecture when it comes to information and sharing, intelligence sharing that the department looks at. And there's a couple of mutually reinforcing parts, one of which is informing the first responders in our communities there when it comes to pre-operational indicators of terrorist attack, as well as criminal behaviors associated with terrorism. And that's in the form of the nationwide suspicious activity reporting that we've been able to embrace and train hundreds of thousands of first responders throughout the country to be cognizant of that pre-operational activity and a means in order to get that information to the right hands, whether it be the Joint Terrorism Task Force or the like, in order to have that suspicious behavior investigated. All embracing privacy, civil rights, civil liberty concerns throughout that process. Another is the informing our public, and we do that through the If You See Something, Say Something campaign. The idea being there is very similar, to inform our public to be cognizant of those type of behaviors and activities, and the ability to report that to the right people in order to make them aware so that it could be further investigated. Another piece is the National Threat Advisory System. Everyone remembers the old perpetual code yellow lasting in perpetuity. Today, the National Threat Advisory System is tailored towards specific intelligence and geared towards notifying those key stakeholders, whether it's a particular critical infrastructure sector or whether it's a particular area of our country or a particular community, in order to inform them based on the intelligence and information at hand. And also, more importantly, to have a shelf life where that information will either be resolved or expire, so that we don't go into that situation like we did before with that desensitizing of everyone with that continuous elevated level. Lastly, and most importantly, is the National Network of Fusion Centers. The ability for the touch point of national security to meet Homeland Security. And what I mean by that is it's the opportunity for threat information from the intelligence community to come down and intersect with state and local partners. The idea there is the state and local partners through the National Network of Fusion Centers can do two things. One, they can look at that threat information and apply localized context to it in order to in turn return that localized context to add value to the information of the threat to the intelligence community. But also as important is to better inform the key stakeholders within that state and local environment to in turn be able to mitigate whatever that threat is. So it really has transformed the ability to share information from the federal government as, in a two-way flow, not only across the horizon with fusion center to fusion center interaction, but more importantly between the federal government, state and locals, and back up. One of the things that my office does is we are the intelligence community lead to support the fusion centers and our state and local partners, and we coordinate that through collaboration with the FBI and other federal agencies in order to provide a variety of things towards that mission. One of which is we have intelligence officers distributed throughout the continental United States and our territories to provide that subject matter expertise in the fusion centers. Another support element is the distribution of classified level systems in order for those state and locals with the appropriate security clearances to be able to read and act on that threat information coming out of the intelligence community. Third is the ability to have technical assistance and training. So we accomplish a variety of different things in that nature, and one of which is ranges from analytical exchanges from the federal government and state and locals to also technical assistance on a particular mission set, and also the ability to help sustain fusion centers through the availability of federal grants. We all have bosses, and one of my bosses is Congress. And part of what they're very interested in is their return on investment, on the investment that they have made over the years into this national network. The tool we use in order to do so is known as the annual assessment, which is part of the Fusion Center performance plan that we coordinate. That has grown over the past couple of years, and we are happy to say that the 2012 assessment, the data is in. It'll be released sometime in the spring, and I'm happy to report that there's been a positive growth and improvement in the overall performance of the national network on the ability, again, to receive, analyze, distribute, and gather information important to the country as well as the community. So with that, Kshemendra, I'll stop and turn it over to a good friend of mine who sat across the table while I was reporting to those bosses at Congress, Christian.
Thanks, and I guess start by saying I'm glad to no longer be one of those bosses, given the popularity of Congress today. After 6 years working up on the Hill, I was getting to the point where self-loathing was taking over. As Kshemendra mentioned, I'm working today for the Homeland Security Policy Institute over at George Washington University, one of the a nonpartisan think tank that's associated with the university. But my remarks today will largely reflect the oversight and work that I've done on the federal support for fusion centers over the last 6 years, watching the network develop and mature over that period of time. I'm not a practitioner, as the others on the panel are, on the day-to-day sort of operational side, but having been in the role that I was in, been an observer to the maturation and progress made in this network, and have some general observations on where things stand, what the challenges are today, what some of the new key issues are likely to be going forward. First, I guess my baseline general observation would be that looking at this network back to when I first started working on the issue in 2007, it's just seen tremendous progress made to mature fusion centers to the point where what was still there were a few centers that were relatively well established at that time, but now you do have a broad national network that is playing a critical role in making our nation safer, not just with respect to counterterrorism, but with respect to a number of other key national security and criminal issues. I think it's also clear that there's been a growing and strong leadership commitment at the federal level for supporting state and local fusion centers, emphasis on the fact that they are state and local entities. But DHS and other federal partners, the PMIC, have played a critical role in providing them both with funding, with personnel, with training, with support for classified connectivity that has helped to bring these federal national security priorities down to the hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers around the country, first responders, and really build this national network that we need to find and find evidence of criminal or violent, criminal activity or national security threats, and make sure that agencies at all levels of government are working together. And I do think we are at the point now where the majority of centers are serving as effective partners to federal agencies on these issues, and working on a day-to-day basis well with them. So that's the positive side of the story. At the same time, there are, as I think all of us on the panel know, a number of key challenges that fusion centers face today. First of all, there's a decline there's been a decline over the last 3 or 4 years in the amount of grant funding from the Department of Homeland Security through the UASI and SHISCAP programs, a portion of which goes to fusion centers. At the same time, it should be noted that as that overall pie has been shrinking, the level of funding going to fusion centers from within that pie has actually increased as DHS has made it a priority for states and localities to make their investments on fusion centers versus some of the other allowable uses for those grants. But still you're dealing with a reduced pot of funding, so that, you know, is an ongoing challenge. The second, you know, challenge is that you do still have variability in the maturity and the effectiveness of the different fusion centers. A lot of them, as I mentioned, are very good, but there are some of them that are still nascent and growing, and you know, sort of have an unclear relationship with some of the other, you know, federal partners or with some of the other state agencies, and you know, so from the standpoint of, you know, the perception of what this network looks like, you know, it's easy to sort of point to, you know, from the outside to a fusion center or a few fusion centers that might, you know, be underperforming, and use that to sort of generalize about the network overall. You know, and another, you know, issue, and again, this is, you know, variable depending upon where you are in the country, is I do think you still have an uneven relationship in some parts of the country with the JTDFs and with other federal entities. I think there are many places in the country where the JTDFs and the fusion centers work well together, and I think there has been a strong commitment at the senior leadership of the FBI at headquarters to provide, you know, for the Bureau to support fusion centers, but you know, translating that down into the field in a field office structure that is still, you know, very independent and autonomous given the FBI culture is one of those things that, you know, that still seem to always pop up again, you know, on a case-by-case basis, you know, as we were doing oversight. You know, another challenge, something that Scott alluded to, is the challenge of quantifying the benefits of fusion centers to stakeholders, you know, in Congress and elsewhere in the federal government and state legislatures. You know, given that, you know, success for a fusion center, you know, in some cases it might be, you know, arresting somebody and you know, putting them away, but in other cases it might be, you know, deterring something or being aware of something that might be something but turns out to not be something once you look more closely into it. So, you know, so then you need to rely on more qualitative metrics to a certain extent to sort of understand the value of the network, and you know, some of that is just, you know, having a more well-informed, you know, cadre of law enforcement and other first responder personnel who sort of know what to look for. Some of that is, you know, just having the effective means to share information when something arises. As there have been several examples in the last few years where, you know, threat information's come in on, you know, from foreign intelligence that got down to the local level pretty quickly, and fusion centers have been a means to, you know, to do that. So, but, you know, trying to sort of quantify that from sort of a return on investment standpoint, you know, is inherently challenging. And I give DHS a lot of credit and the PMIC for the work that they've done to do that, but it's not something that's easy to sort of, you know, do from sort of a quantitative standpoint. And I think the final challenge has been, you know, some of these issues with public relations and you know, and I include Congress within that. You know, given, you know, fusion centers, to their credit, have been pretty engaged and forward-leaning with both in their local communities and in Washington to try to explain what they're doing. You know, bring in members of the media, local media. You know, bring in, you know, key constituent groups. You know, and build sort of that network of support. That's, you know, that's what fusion centers are. They're supposed to be sort of open entities that, you know, bringing in all affected stakeholders. But, you know, doing that sort of then opens you up to, you know, a level of scrutiny in terms of, you know, what you're doing that, you know, other parts of the, you know, the broader apparatus, you know, don't necessarily have. So, you know, so I do think, you know, you have, you know, to the extent that there have been public critiques of, you know, fusion centers, you know, pursuant to, you know, some of the, you know, Washington Post reporting a couple years ago, their Top Secret America series. A lot of that is because, you know, they have been, you know, open and willing to engage with the media more so than other parts of you know, some of their partners might be. Yeah, I guess a couple minutes on sort of, you know, the role of Congress with respect to fusion centers. The first thing I think that's always worth reminding is that, you know, Congress is not, nor should it have, direct oversight of fusion centers. They're state and local entities, state legislatures, you know, or in some cases, you know, if they're urban area ones, mayors and city councils, you know, that's their responsibility. What we did have oversight for, and, you know, my colleagues who are still there have oversight for, is the federal support for fusion centers. And I think that's something, you know, working on the committee that I worked on for Senator Lieberman with colleagues on the minority staff and you know, House colleagues that we engaged in pretty vigorously over the years to try to make sure that that support was being used effectively and efficiently. Some of you might be aware of the report that one of the subcommittees of our committee put out by Senator Coburn last year was pretty critical of fusion centers. That wasn't a report that I had anything to do with, nor the full committee did, but it was, and we can go into a little bit more on that in Q&A if you want, but I think it was misleading in some respects, but it does reflect the realities of the environment that fusion centers are in now, given the overall budget constraints that the U.S. is facing, given where we are now, nearly 12 years after 9/11, and the different perception in the public about threats, given the success, ironically, that all of the agencies have had in preventing another major attack on the homeland. So I do think, some of that is the reality in which fusion centers are going to need to operate, and it's incumbent on them to to sort of still be engaged with Congress, and it's incumbent on people who have worked to build this network to be out there and supporting it, as I think all of the major law enforcement groups have done, and DHS and others following that report coming out. Finishing up, just going forward, just a couple other sort of key questions, new issues that could arise with fusion centers. We can address any of those in Q&A. One key question that we wrestled with from a congressional perspective was, you do have the funding model for fusion centers in terms of the federal support they receive is through these broader grant programs, and and that we could spend a lot of time on that. I won't, but there is a question that can be raised is should at some point the federal government move to a more direct funding model for fusion centers instead of going through the broader grant program. It's an issue that we wrestled with, and I think is something that still will be debated in years to come. I think another issue is clarifying still sort of the lanes in the road between fusion centers, JTTFs, FIGs, the new J-rigs, the HIDA centers, and in some cases there have been efforts to clarify those, but again, I still think that that's an area where where work needs to be done, and leadership attention needs to be focused in years to come. And then a final issue, given something you've probably talked about in other panels on the conference is cybersecurity. The question of what the role is for fusion centers with respect to cybersecurity, and I think they can play have the potential to play a key role in terms of interacting with some of the private sector stakeholders in their area of responsibility on cybersecurity, helping to protect their own state or local networks, given the sensitive information that's on them. And I think building out those capabilities, as some centers have done, is something that'll be sort of a new growing priority for fusion centers in years to come. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Christian. Next up is Mike Sena. He's actively leading the Northern California Fusion Center, and also in his role as president of the National Fusion Center Association, has a really very good perspective to share with us.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invite and for your attendance here. Kind of give you a perspective. I started out a couple decades ago with the state of California as a law enforcement officer, and started out working vice, narcotics, major crimes, violent crimes, and later intelligence. But I started out in 1993 when I got a call from the DEA saying, hey, we've got this interesting subject that we're looking at, and he's moving enough pseudoephedrine to basically clear all the colds of the western U.S. And I go, well, there's one key ingredient that is, and that's for making methamphetamine. And it led to large fundraising organizations and funds that were going to the Middle East, which led to cigarette smuggling, led to credit card investigations. So for me, my whole career trying to delineate, okay, what's terrorism, funding, support, what's related to terrorism, and what's criminal, it's always been intertwined. So about 6 years ago, I was sent over by my agency to be the deputy director for our fusion center. And just last, well, 2 months ago, I became the director and moved over to the San Mateo Sheriff's Office, which always confuses my family because they're like, you know, you used to work for DOJ, now you're sheriffs, but you're doing the same job. I go, yeah, it's very confusing. But the way fusion centers have been set up, it's unusual for most organizations. But I want you to think of them as big task forces. Big task force with 1,600 people across the country, with 78 operations, 49 state, 26 regional or major urban area centers, and 3 territorial centers that are building themselves up right now. And with this network we've created, and there's also confusion because DHS is our designated partner in the federal government to work with fusion centers. So there's often this misnomer that fusion centers are DHS components or that it's the DHS fusion centers. And that's not the case. These truly are task forces that were organically created by the states. It's the state governors that designate their fusion center. It's in coordination with our federal partners. Each fusion center has to have a privacy policy because we know that if we don't have the trust of the public at the state and local level, we can't operate. And that is something that we have been instilling since our foundation. When you think about this fusion center network, you know, post 9/11, we had initial efforts in Arizona, New York, California to build fusion centers up with no guidance. They said, we need to share information, but how do we do that? The other part of this is, when you think about these 79 basic task force or 78 task force operations across the country, it was because we have 800,000 law enforcement agencies around this nation. 800,000 police officers. When you start looking at the fire and the EMS, you're looking at another 2 million people out there. How do you coordinate with all those groups? And domestically, we're decentralized law enforcement public safety organizations. You may have multiple law enforcement organizations operating within the same county or within the same city. So how do you keep everybody up to speed, educate them, and train them? And that is really the role that fusion centers have taken over. Building out liaison officer programs to train all those folks out there that we can. What are those suspicious behaviors? Not looking at who a person is by appearance, but what they're doing. And based on the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative and the protocols, sharing that data and getting that information to our partners, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, who are the legs on the ground. Those are the investigators. Fusion centers are support organizations, built up of multiple agencies, organizations, but not just the law enforcement, because that's what we've looked at as cops and police officers. We bring our fellow police officers to look at a problem. But this is not just a law enforcement problem. It's a fire problem. It's a public safety problem. And it's definitely a private sector critical infrastructure problem. And those are the people we have to reach out to, and the people that we are reaching out to and bringing into this network to identify what those risks are. And what we're doing is basically trying to mitigate those risks, looking at the threats, looking at our vulnerabilities, looking at the consequences if we fail. And that's something that the federal government has no ability to reach out to that large of depth of a group. And that's where the state and local fusion centers come into play. But it's not just the state and local fusion centers, it's the federal partners that we bring into those operations as well. When we talk about 18,000 organizations across the country, that means 18,000 different records management systems. Now, many people who see Minority Report think we just have a wall up there and we're moving around and able to pull all the data. It doesn't happen. There are a lot of companies that are making money saying they can do that. But we have so many different mechanisms out there to collect data. Right now, on a daily basis, I have 78 different databases that we're logging into to try to pull data together, to bring that information, so we can identify those next threats, so that we can put the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the right direction. And the other part of this is, you know, terrorism is a primary focus of why fusion centers were developed in the first place. But they really are to deal with the major threats and those priority threats that our communities deal with. Because if we've got people like, and my old boss brought this up to Congress a few times, in the city of Oakland, which is right across from our office in the Bay Area, you know, we have on average 700 people shot a year there. Now, about 120 to 135 of those folks die each year. The reason that mortality rate isn't as high as it should be is because of good trauma centers, putting people together. But that is true violence. If we had 700 people shot in a day, there'd be a national cry. But because it's stretched out throughout the year, we're looking at those threats and we're trying to focus the resources, and that's the job of intelligence, to identify those threats and vulnerabilities and try to provide direction to those folks who have the resources. And resources are dwindling in the public sector. We are losing people constantly. My own former agency, the California Department of Justice, budget was cut by 50% last year. It went from a staff of about 600 agents in the field, almost 700, to 200 people for a statewide organization. Now, on the local level, it's the same. We're losing the ability to be proactive. And when we talk about the intelligence capacity that we're building up, it doesn't exist. It had not existed. You had a few major cities that had intelligence units and had that capacity. And even back into the 50s, 60s, and 70s where there was this cry, we need to have better intelligence. We need to have better capability. The resources have not been there. But it took 9/11, it took tragedy to bring together all the resources from multiple agencies to put them in the same room. And in my center in San Francisco, we have 23 different agencies, staff of 70 people, federal, state, local, fire department personnel, emergency management personnel, all working together, all seeing these issues, working on the outreach and training, trying to train everyone in this nation on what suspicious behavior looks like, what it is, and how to report that information and coordinate it. And when you think about the 22,000 plus leads that come into the nationwide suspicious activity reporting initiative, who can look at that? Who can look at all of that data and get it to the right place? It's that network of 78 operations that are looking through that information. And some of it isn't terrorism related, some of it's narcotics related, some of it's other programs related, other violent crimes, getting that to the right people. And what we've done in San Francisco is combining our high intensity drug trafficking area, focusing on the narcotics threats and the drug trafficking organizations that we're combating across this nation, bringing them in the same place, and putting our JTTF in the same space. So that way they're working together on a daily basis and coordinating that data. And those are the things that we miss. And oftentimes we hear from critics who say, well, what have they done for us lately? The unfortunate part of this is, as Christian knows, is oftentimes we have classified information which it's trying to pull teeth out of people to get that data. And the other part is prevention is a hard thing to measure. It's one of the hardest things to measure. When you do your job right, nothing happens. And when we look across the country and how many attacks or potential attacks could have happened but did not, how many people here even know that I had a subject a week and a half ago that went to the bank or was going to attempt to blow up Bank of America in Oakland? Nothing happened. It didn't blow up.
How many folks knew about that?
Okay, that just tells you. If nothing happens, no one pays attention. But you know, that subject in 2011 was found with an AK-47, 30-round magazine in his place in Santa Clara County, San Jose. And that report came into the Fusion Center. But years later, we have an actual person who drove up to the Bank of America in a Suburban with what he believed were explosives that were provided by the FBI, and nothing happened. That's happened over 40 times in this country, but nobody sees it. Those are the things that Fusion Centers support every day. And other activities, other violent crime activities, trying to provide direction, analysis, and resources that don't exist otherwise. And that's why the network is so important to our nation. But it's one of those things that usually gets the negative press attention of they become spy agencies or organizations. But Fusion Centers don't have folks out there trying to convert sources of information. We're there to collect and support that collection of data, that analysis of the data, the training to provide people to know what are the constitutional rights. We always tell people, just because 9/11 happened doesn't mean we're getting rid of the Constitution or the laws of this nation. We're here to support it. We're here to protect the privacy of our public. We're here to try to reach out to our public and collect data and really try to be as open as possible. And I could tell you guys every week I have about 5 groups that tour my center trying to tell people what we do and how we do it and why we do it and bringing that commitment. But it takes time. And this is a new network. Most centers were built after 2007 and our guidance didn't come out until 2008. So in this project, the long-term goals that we have, it's strengthening the network. And some people say, do we have too many Fusion Centers? Are there too many? Is 78 too much? But it's an organic thing. It's based on the needs of the communities. And each fusion center does have nuances based on what those needs are. Things that are happening in Montana are different than things that are happening in San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or the Arizona border. And the focus of fusion centers are on the needs of that region, that community. And there is no other organization out there that has ever been built that has been able to do that job. And it's a big job. But thanks to the support of our partners who were in the Senate and Congress and the folks that are still there, our friends at DHS, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and especially the FBI, who are the legs on the ground out there. Oftentimes people forget that there's only 13,000 agents in the FBI. A few more folks are added through the Joint Terrorism Task Force from state and local entities, but their job is investigation. Our job is intelligence. And, I always have to thank Kshemendra Paul because he is on the forefront of this, always pushing these efforts forward. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mike. It was quite a tour de force here across the panelists, and I was really struck. Kind of the first question, and I'm going to ask the panelists one or two questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So I would like folks to be thinking about questions to ask these distinguished panelists. I was really struck by what's the true role of fusion centers. Some people have this idea that fusion centers are just pure play CT devices, but talking and listening to the panelists, there's this broader information sharing across terrorism and other priority threats, right? The focus about keeping communities safe, they're being rooted in our federal system of democracy with state and locals. What is the true role of fusion centers? Are they pure play CT or is it broad based? And let me start with Russ and just kind of walk down and if we can talk about that.
Thanks, Kshemendra. Great question. So reflecting on that history, you go back to capacity building, the building of a capability for decision makers to know about those things that threaten them. 1967, it was organized crime and it was civil disorder. In 2001, it was terrorism. You look to the future and we all know it's here right now and it's going to be in the future, cyber. And from the intelligence community perspective, the community through DHS and FBI has to have a place or a mechanism by which intelligence about these types of threats, priority threats, can be communicated to other decision makers. So from my perspective and given my history, fusion centers were about CT at the time and they emerged in that era. They're about a mechanism by which intelligence, isn't in the way I defined it, can be shared and exchanged two-way on priority threats.
Scott, what's your perspective?
Well, just to add to what Russ had to say, another piece is what we face today with countering violent extremism. When you look at the traditional counterterrorism type offender, you look at someone that the intelligence community has built-in tripwires in order to identify those folks. When you look today at the environment of a person that's getting radicalized in their living room or bedroom that doesn't travel overseas to attend a training camp and try and return to the United States, but in essence acts alone, who better knows who that individual might be than the local community? It's not the conventional Cold War intelligence community that's going to be able to identify that individual because those usual tripwires aren't in place. There's not that overseas nexus. So the fusion centers play a key role working with their communities in order to be able to help counter that violent extremism element that we face today, as well as what Russ talked about as far as today's threat environment. When you look at the department's facing transnational organized crime, cyber, Al-Qaeda individuals, as well as those that believe in the beliefs of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. So it's a broad swath of today's threat environment, and the fusion centers play such a critical role in that, in addition to not only addressing the intelligence and information needs of the federal government, but also their own stakeholders, which is their local communities, their police chiefs, their sheriffs, and their other first responders within their area of responsibility.
Yeah, from a congressional perspective, we had this debate to a certain extent back in 2007 when Congress was working as part of the 2007 9/11 Commission Recommendations Act on enabling legislation for the federal role in terms of its support for fusion centers. There was a provision in that broader bill, focused on those issues, and certainly at the time, counterterrorism was and still is a preeminent focus of what the federal priorities were for fusion centers. But at no point during those discussions was it ever thought or considered that that should be, the only focus for what fusion centers should be. I think we always, took the perspective that, just from the day-to-day realities of, what you're going to see, you aren't going to see a terrorist every day or every week, but you are going to see violent crime, and you are going to see other, legal activity that could, in a lot of cases could lead you to, could be the basis for leading you to, what turns out to be, terrorist-related activity, which we have seen in a number of cases. So, I think, at least, where I used to sit, always consistently believe that fusion centers should be, all crimes, all hazards, should, make their own determination to a certain extent on what the scope of their activity should be. And, given the convergence of threats, as Scott alluded to, between, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, organized crime, cyber threats, it's the lines between those disciplines is becoming increasingly blurry, both internationally and on the domestic side, and you can't easily segment, what you're looking at until you look at it.
And that, yes, absolutely. And on that tail end, as far as the role of the analyst, when the state of California first started their first fusion center operation, the California Anti-Terrorism Information Center, they, big press announcement, we built our first Intel Center, and we're waiting for your call. Send us your tips, your leads, and for a few months, they're sitting there like the Maytag repairman waiting for someone to call them, and no one called. One, they didn't have a network created, they didn't have the ability to go out there and train people, so they're just hoping someone would call them with a tip or lead. Look for a terrorist and tell me when you see one. And that was the attitude. And it was an abysmal failure. It finally collapsed in 2003 after a few bad incidents of reporting information and actually giving out their story, and it imploded on itself. And in 2004, we revamped the entire system in California to build out these regional centers, to have that coordination effort, to build out the liaison officer program. But when you look for a terrorist, you don't say, okay, I'm just looking for the guy that's going to buy the end pipes and the pipes to match each one. And let me know you when you find them, because that's not what to look for. And you can't base it on what a person looks like, because as we've seen, we've had so many different people that want to blow us up or cause harm to our public. So during this process, we've trained people what to look for. And we've also said, if you have other major threat, major criminal activities that you need support on, let us know. It keeps our analysts sharp. It also allows us to protect our communities and to put the resources that we've developed, highly trained individuals, to use. And that is why that all threats, all crimes perspective is there. And also, you don't want to be the person, well, this isn't really a terrorism thing. How do you know? Shouldn't you make that call? Let the people review it, decide? Because you can't see those connections if you don't have access to all the systems and all the data and all the points of information. And the other part of that is being able to share that data appropriately with a larger mass. How would the federal government in any way be able to share information with the fire service, the emergency medical personnel, infrastructure, all those different levels, and know what those clients want? To be able to have a relationship where you say, pick up the phone and say, hey, you're stupid. And we get that sometimes. This is what I see, and let me help you out. And it's that community thing. It's bringing people from your communities and making them your subject matter experts, people who have a greater expertise in their fields of knowledge. And it really adds to what we're doing, contributes to our nation, but on multiple levels, on the all crimes, all threats, and all hazards perspective. My Fusion Center partners don't always like the all hazards perspective, but during disasters, we need to be able to share information. And I can tell you that during Sandy, the folks in New Jersey, they made that happen.
That's great. And if anybody wants to ask a question, there's some microphones in the audience. Just line up. I'm going to ask one more question here, but I want to come back to this issue of funding sustainment, right? We in the public sector here in this country, we have a tremendous crisis. We see it every day, sequestration and things like that. It's been much worse at the state and local level. It hits sooner. You guys have had to absorb those cuts. You know, one of the things that's always impressed me, Mike, about your fusion center is that it's also the HIDTA, the high intensity drug trafficking area. That's before the war on terror, the war on drugs, right? So there's that. You're co-located with the FBI in San Francisco. You've got on the order of 25,000 liaison officers across Northern California, smaller departments as well as the private sector. It really is this community-based approach. We have federal support, as we were talking about, for fusion centers, but fusion centers are owned by state and local entities. You have to make that business case to your board of governors, the county executives, the mayors, the chiefs of police. Can you talk about sustainment a little bit, and can we maybe just walk down back on sustainment, and then we'll just take some questions from the audience?
Certainly, and you know, when we started doing our assessments with DHS, one of the interesting things that I found out when, you know, because I didn't even know this at the time, but that the funding for fusion centers, oftentimes people think that the federal government is paying for all the fusion center operations in the nation. But when we looked at the numbers and broke them down, 60% of the funding and resources were coming from the state and locals, and 40% was coming from the federal government, which is something that no one really knew at the time until we actually started doing those assessments. And it is a hard argument, and it's very difficult. And you know, a few years ago in Utah, they actually zeroed out their fusion center's budget. Said, hey, you know what? I'm not sure what this fusion center thing is, but we funded it for a couple of years, and yeah, do we really need that? And some bean counter said, no, let's just skip that. And the next thing you know, every chief of police in the state of Utah and every law enforcement public safety organization resoundingly said, are you guys fools? This is one of the key resources we have to share information in real time and to have analytical resources. And they reversed that pretty quickly on that. But it's hard to make that, you know, that case when you have police departments, sheriff's departments, state police, attorney general's office and their investigators, which are losing incredible staff right now. And they're having difficulty covering patrol shifts. So assigning a person to a fusion center is difficult. And we are struggling every day to make sure that we have that staffing level. And we're struggling every day to make our case to Congress and the Senate to continue the funding on these resources, to focus what we're doing. And it's something, and it's the reason I'm here today, to get that message out that it's so critical that we continue what we started. We've invested a lot of money to build these operations, both at the state level, the local level, and the federal level. And it's capacity that we're going for. When I talk about sustainment, it's not as much the funding part as the resources we've developed, the personnel that we've trained. Those are our real treasure, our national treasure for information sharing.
Yeah, it's really, really very remarkable when you think about it. From, you know, the 9/11 Commission talked about the need for whole of government solutions. The Markle Foundation sketched out in a lot of detail this idea of a whole of government approach, and it's in place now. This is really something new under the sun in terms of working across levels of government, co-funding, and generating through common business processes like the nationwide suspicious activity reporting initiative, like the way we handle alerts, warnings, and notifications, safety, and the importance for the nation. We have somebody lined up to ask a question.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen.
Can you just identify yourself and ask the question?
Yes, my name is Maria Magoulas-Perkins, IBM, and I'm also a member of the AFCEA Intelligence Committee. Thank you all for being here to share information on the topic of information sharing. Mike, you've mentioned training several times, and there's been a lot of criticism about the kind and amount of training that's given to the analysts before they're deployed and before they're allowed to disseminate and issue reports. So I wanted you to comment on that if you could, and other members of the panel as well. And a related question, in the spirit of knowledge sharing and information sharing, have other agencies that are more established in the area of analysis shared what they know, and have they supported you in training your analysts that you deploy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And you know, when I first found out about the issue of the question of training, it was in the Coburn report, and I can't remember which news agency called me out of the blind. They'd actually gotten the report, I think, 2 days before anybody else, and said, well, we understand there's an issue with training. And you know, I said, well, I'm not too clear on that. Could you send me a copy of the report? That's how I got my copy. And it was focusing on that report on the training provided to the DHS reports officers, which was a new program of folks deployed in the field. And as far as fusion centers, we've worked with, LEIU, ILEA, those organizations at the state and local level that deal with education and training for analysts. And oftentimes I say there is a differentiation between a crime analyst and an intelligence analyst as far as the work expectations and the training that those folks need provided. And from the federal perspective, I got to tell you, some of the best folks we've had have been folks from the FBI, folks from DHS, INA, that have come out and assigned to fusion centers to train people up, and also mobile training that we provide them as well. And as well as the FBI being wants to send people to Quantico to their analytical training courses. So as far as the level of training for folks, that basic training, the analysts have pat. The intermediate training is something that has improved. The advanced training is where we really need to go for our analytical resources out there. We're not quite where I want to be, but we're a heck of a lot better than we were 3 years ago. And that is where I've seen some of the greatest growth, but that's where we need to continue that movement and momentum. I always tell people it takes 3 years to get an analyst just up to speed. It takes another 3 years to get them up to that journeyman level. So it's a cycle that takes a while. And when you consider that majority of fusion centers are less than 4 years old, they're just getting to that point right now. And I always have to mention that as soon as I get them up to that expertise level, one of the other three-letter agencies in the federal system always snag them. They always pay about $20,000 more. But, it's always that constant cycle.
Yeah,
That's
we,
great.
we
Scott,
go and steal them. Just to add what Mike's comments were, there's a couple of things that when it comes to training, one of which is that we have a baseline analytical capability mandated for fusion center analysts to achieve. So, and that's actually put into the grant guidance stemming back to 2010. So that's a mandatory adherence that they must meet for that baseline ability to train and be trained. Another piece too, as I mentioned in my comments about analytical exchanges, we talk about some of the imbalance when it comes to, you have some fusion centers that are very robust, very sophisticated, very complex, and some that are newer and perhaps smaller. We afford the opportunity to conduct analytical exchanges, not only through those fusion centers, but also with our federal partners and also with our HIDA and RISC folks too, so that the opportunity is there for those analysts that are in need of additional mentoring and training and the like, that we make that available. We provide a variety of different training opportunities ranging from online tradecraft abilities to the ability to attend the Sherman Kent School that the CIA affords.
Yeah, I think that training is actually an area where the federal government has accepted an obligation in this area and has actually done a lot of work between FBI, DOJ, DHS, my office, PMISC, to get the curriculum out there, the material, the sponsor training, and I think there's definitely a view towards a unified analytic enterprise sort of thing across the network spanning levels of government. We have some more questions over here.
Hi, my name's Art Peterson. I'm just a private consultant, but I spent a fair amount of time in DHS and NCTC prior to doing what I'm doing now. I want to thank the panel first for just a wonderful discussion, tremendous insights, and obviously a lot of expertise that you've shared with us, and I think that's really great. My question is that other countries, there are at least a couple of other countries who have come over and looked at what we're doing, and this specifically relates to your point about this as being new, and they've looked at what we're doing and have found the model that we're using going down to the local fusion centers or state and local fusion centers is something that they need to adapt, and they're in much higher threat environments and have been in high threat environments for a number of years, and they find the model that we've done to be an acceptable model, and they have much tougher laws regarding the relationship between state entities and federal entities. So I think you're onto something there, and I think the country is onto something valuable. But the fusion centers have to be able to get their data. One of the things they might do, at least from a counterterrorism standpoint, is get their data up so that you have the connectivity of what, from my military background, we used to describe as space to mud. Okay, so we have all the, we want to be able to cover that full spectrum with data flowing back and forth. And of course, in the terrorism context, the large number of police officers represent the largest single collectors, largest body of collectors we have to deal with what could be a very thorny threat issue. And I'd like you to comment on what are the efforts to try and not just pass the data to the JTTF, but to make the fusion centers a reliable source of data on par with what other collection agencies might be bringing to the table for the threats that they see.
Great. I think this is the kind of thing that maybe we can just briefly go down, but what comes to mind is things like you know, the work that we've been doing around sensitive but unclassified network interoperability and collaboration environments, including DHS's Homeland Security Information Network, FBI's LEO, RISNet, Intel-Link as a connectivity fabric and things like that. There's also the, you know, the work that we've been doing, you know, the suspicious activity reporting initiative that folks were talking about is really, you know, that kind of grassroots collector, you know, kind of approach. Between 300,000 and 400,000 police officers have been trained, and the 16 behaviors reasonably indicative of pre-operational criminal planning and terrorism-related activity, and that's a pretty integrated process. But do folks, anybody here want to kind of comment on that or add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was also going to mention suspicious activity reporting, which I think is a critical element of what you're talking about, in addition to the formal IARs, HIRs that are, you know, sent back from, you know, by the INA reps back to, you know, back into the intelligence system. You know, there's also, you know, a fair amount of this that happens, you know, more sort of, you know, less on paper than more sort of day-to-day civets, conference calls, you know, picking up the phone and calling somebody, and that doesn't always get as documented as well, but, you know, that is a pretty robust exchange of information. You know, to your first point about international, I do think, you know, there are some lessons here for other countries that have a federal system of, you know, that, you know, I think, you know, very few countries, if any, of the same number of you know, law enforcement agencies that we have. I'd be surprised if anywhere else in the world is 18,000 law enforcement agencies. But, you know, the UK, by contrast, has 42 that, you know, that MI5 has to interact with. So that's a much simpler, you know, task that they have in dealing with the regional police departments, you know, around the UK. You know, but for other countries that do have a federal system, I do think there are, you know, that there are some lessons learned here.